All right, welcome back to Talking Capitalism. Today we are talking with my good friend Rohan Kalyan at Virginia Commonwealth. He is the author of very many things, including a wonderful book called Neo Delhi and the Politics of Post-Colonial Urbanism. I happen to know he's working on another one, but I don't know if he's going to want to talk about that. We'll see what he chooses to talk to us about. He also wrote a wonderful piece recently, a couple years, I guess now, called Eventocracy, Media, Politics, and Times in Aspirational Fascism. We were just talking a little bit about fascism before you all tuned in. And another fun fact about Dr. Kalyan is he is also a filmmaker in his spare time. He did a film, I guess quite a few years ago now, Rohan? With his 2018, yeah, with his brother, it's called, what was it called? Letter to the City Yet to Come, yeah?
Oh, that one, yeah, the short film, sure,
The
yeah,
short
yeah.
film. And tell us about, well, okay, I'm going to give him an opportunity to introduce himself properly. But yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your other films, the other kinds of things that keep you busy, and while you're at it, tell us a little bit about how you started learning about capitalism.
Sure, yeah, yeah, that might get us there a little bit. So the first feature-length film that I made is a documentary called Badiou, and it's about a French philosopher named Alain Badiou, who has written, among other things, a lot about capitalism and about globalization. But I think I would have to say my interest in capitalism probably predates that by a lot. I think, like many people, I think college was a pretty formative time for me to like really start reading about the history of the economy. Yeah, it's something about, I grew up in the US. We don't really have economics classes. Maybe now they do, but when I was growing up, we never had economics classes or even political science or anything like that in high school. It was a pretty depoliticized kind of curriculum, you know. You have your social sciences here, you have your sciences there. And it really wasn't until college that I started thinking more about politics and thinking about it as something to sort of read more into. And I would say my journey in terms of studying capitalism starts from there, probably around 23 years ago, something like that.
Right on. Yeah. I mean, that certainly, I remember that echoes a lot my experience as well. I did have a class in politics and economics, but I think we were the only high school in the whole area that had it. But yeah, no. All right. Well, thanks for that. I want to turn our attention to the text that you shared with the class. So they would have read the selection that you gave us by Singh. And from the parts that I've read of it thus far, it really seems to do a great job of throwing back the veil of like speculative finance and the kind of whole almost imaginary aspect of capitalism and how that works. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about the text, why it's important to you, and what you think we should take from it.
Sure, yeah. So the text, I think, was originally written in 2000. It was then part of Anna Singh's book called Friction, which I think is the subtitle of the book. Friction is a global ethnography of connection, I believe. So she's an anthropologist, and I've really been teaching this text, I would say, probably since around 2005, 2006, when I first started teaching undergraduates. So I've been teaching this class almost as long as the essay has been around. And I got to say, like the context around how we talk about capitalism, how we talk about globalization, things like global finance has really changed so much since like 2006, when I first started teaching this, versus now. I mean, for one thing, the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, that happened. And I think that also had another effect of lifting the veil, as you put it, right? And kind of unleashing just how destructive and oftentimes irrational market forces and finance, these things that we've been told were rational and efficient and the best way of allocating resources because it's done by this impersonal market kind of context, that was revealed. I mean, it's not the first time it was revealed, but in 2008, on a global scale, it was revealed to be particularly destructive and irrational and unpredictable, really.
Yeah.
And that was for a lot of people, that was a formative time to start thinking about capitalism. But for me, teaching a text like this, it gave me a kind of another way of sort of revisiting the ideas in this text in particular. Because I think what Anna Singh is interested in as an anthropologist, someone who studies culture, I think she's interested in the cultures of capitalism, the cultures of globalization. And that doesn't mean that she's not interested in the economics. She's interested in the sort of cultural components of economics, of capitalism. And I think the way I like to put it is, when you learn about, so I said I never took economics in high school. When I started taking economics in college, it wasn't necessarily less problematic. I mean, the way they teach economics in the United States in colleges, and oftentimes in other parts of the Anglophonic world, especially, is as this science, as this sort of, this sort of reification of the market. Or what I mean by that is this idea that you can completely map out an economy and isolate all its working parts and understand how all those parts work together. And you have this holistic thing that we call the economy. And that, I think, is something that, anthropologists, political scientists, political economists have been critiquing for a long time. And I think what Singh does is she tries to find the irrational, the sort of nonlinear processes that work within the economy and that completely sort of oppose the idea that markets are predictable, that they're always efficient. And I think the Indonesia case that she writes about here is perhaps an extreme example, but also probably the most indicative example, considering what was to come about 8 years after this essay was written, right? So in 8 years later, it's not just an Indonesian economy that tailspins, it's an entire global financial architecture that requires interventions that really had never been theorized before, right? So kind of shows you the limits of economics is kind of the big thing for me here. And so you can sort of address that limitation through political economy, traditions of political economy that look at how economies and markets are embedded within social political structures. Then the other sort of aspect to that is the cultural economy as well. How do meanings get assigned to things like capitalism, markets, economics? How do we interpret them? With the idea that, how humans sort of create meaning kind of ends up restricting what they can do about those particular things. So all of this stuff is connected then, politics, culture, economics, right? For me, that's what Singh is really so good at. She brings all those things together.
Oh, that's wonderful. I mean, that cultural dimension in particular, it just strikes me that it can almost lead us into like a false faith in this kind of scientific capability of either policymakers or economists to tinker and fix a problem too, right? When we're seeing it's neat to think about how our cultural kind of disposition and interests actually affects the faith that we express in the mechanicalness of the economy.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think there's something to be said for just how complicated all this stuff is. It's so interconnected, it's so multi-layered, right? And another thing she does really well in this, she kind of unpacks the term globalization, because I think anytime you see the word global, it kind of has a flattening effect. And one thing she does really well here is she connects other kind of scales of thinking, local, regional, national, and global, right? So that you can see that like globalization is never just a thing. It has multiple levels of effect, right? I mean, at the local level, you feel one thing, right? At a regional level, there are other forces, other interests at work. At the national level, right? And as you get higher up in scale, it gets necessarily more complicated, right? So none of this stuff is like to say that, there's a simpler way of explaining this, but it is to sort of really complicate the kind of story that we're generally told about globalization, that it is this sort of beneficial, anonymous force. It's best to just kind of let it work, right? Then that goes with capitalism, it goes with the economy in general, the market, right? You just have to let it operate. So yeah.
So much, over the last even like 150 years of debates about capitalism in the States and in Canada and the world have been this sort of tension between should we have a hands-on or a hands-off but it strikes me, as we're talking about this, that never have we seriously grappled with the idea that the economy may not be this organic thing that you either have hands on or hands off, but rather this cultural confluence of contradictions, all at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really important, the contradictions. I mean, if it is this whole, then it's also kind of divided against itself and kind of continually split.
Hmm.
I think like um I don't think it's a coincidence. I mean, to kind of, maybe we're jumping around a lot, but to see that in this era of globalization, we also have this return to nationalism, and we have this return to fundamentalism, right? As if people need kind of sort of assurances in the face of like the radical uncertainty of the world, or the global economy, or the planet even, so
Mm.
this essay itself doesn't really work at that level in terms of like nationalism and stuff like that. It's where a lot of my research is now,
Mhm.
but in terms of this essay here, she does like think about national politics in the context of globalization. So it's really, there's like multiple sort of levels at which you can kind of engage with this piece.
Mhm.
The politics, the economic culture, you can work with like how the Indonesian government has sort of encountered globalization, how it's sort of almost like sold itself to global markets in a
Yeah.
way, right? So that's also another through line here.
Well, thanks for that. Would love to have you back another time to talk explicitly about the nationalism stuff, but I did promise I'd only take 15 minutes of your
Yeah,
time.
absolutely. Yeah.
So our last question before we let you go then is, assuming that there's kind of one key takeaway that you've learned somewhere in the course of your life that you would like to impart to these first year students of global history, to remember about capitalism, what would that be? Assuming that they can't remember everything that we talk about.
Um, I think my biggest takeaway, which is going to sound a little bit ironic and maybe paradoxical, is don't listen to the experts.
Right.
Because a lot of times the experts know as little as me and you or anyone else, and again, I'll go back to the 2008 crisis, right? Because I was a grad student at the time, and we're reading texts like this, teaching texts like this, but also sort of looking at the world. I kept track of what different economic experts were saying in the years before 2008. It was part of my dissertation research, actually.
Mhm.
And in part, I wanted to do a kind of gotcha thing. All these like New York Times, Washington Post, these very elite kind of institutions that really tailor themselves as the expertise on the economy.
Mhm.
And so they give the impression that capitalism is this very transparent thing, that it works, that it's clearly the best system in the world, and all these things. And so I learned through my own research, and I think a text like this also kind of urges us
Mhm.
to have a less pious attitude, as she puts it, towards the market.
Right,
Right.
right.
So doubt, I think, is an important thing.
Doubt. Yes, that's a wonderful, wonderful takeaway. That you can probably apply that, students, to every aspect of your life. Actually, a good dose of doubt is always going to do you well. Rohan, thank you so much for sharing your time with us, and yeah, we really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Tune in
Thanks for
next week
having me.
for another fantastic episode of Talking Capitalism.